today I will go over the pros and the cons for best of ones and best of threes in MTG. Now, before we get started, I do have to mention that about 2 months ago they did release some stats, and it said that around 95% of all games in MTG Arena was best of ones. But you do have to remember, this was before we had ranked best of threes or ranked at all, and because you can actually earn pack in MTG Arena, people are more likely to go for the best of ones just to get quicker games and to play their more aggressive decks that really work well in a best of one scenario. Anyway, let's get started with the pros of best of ones. So the first pro is going to be speed. Obviously, best of ones go faster, there's only one game, there's less to learn, and in the case you want to actually view the game on the pro level, there's less to actually follow in a best of one, and you don't have to know all about like how good is the deck in post sideboard, how good is the deck in game number 3, etc, etc. So it's a better format for new player to get into. The second pro ties into the first pro, and that is you are required to have less cards in order to get started with the game, and obviously if you're viewing the game there are less cards to learn. For example, if you are playing Paper Magic, you don't have to spend as much money in order to actually play the standard format in a best of one fashion. The same can be said about MTG Arena. You don't need as many wildcards in order to get started with the game. The next pro is going to be about viability. In a best of one format, a lot more decks are actually viable. You can take your fun Dino deck, your Pirate deck, and actually beat a proper tier 1 best of 3 deck in a best of 1 scenario. Obviously, the more powerful tier 1 decks would quite easily take game number 2 and 3, but in a best of 1 format, you could actually stand a chance with your, fun deck. Best of 1 is also very good for combo decks because a lot of things that can answer combo is usually found in the sideboard, and combo decks, they're not very consistent. It's very unlikely you could take a combo deck even in a best of 1 tournament and go all the way because, most combo decks, they tend to stumble at some point, and when they stumble really hard. The next pro of best of 1 is all about the viewship. Obviously there is less stuff to learn, so people that are new to Magic or they may be just browsing Twitch and they find a tournament, if the tournament is held in the best of 1 format, or if the player is playing best of 1 just playing ranked, it's easier for a new player to understand the game and get interested in the game in a best of 1 scenario. Those are the most obvious pros that I can see when it comes to best of 1 in MTG. So let's go look at some cons. The first con is going to be all about counterplay. In a best of 1 format, it can be very frustrating to play against certain decks that are just amazing in a best of 1 scenario. Like I did say this was kind of pro, and of course if you're playing a strong deck in best of 1, obviously you're going to enjoy it, but for overall balance it might not be a good thing. And because in a best of 1 format you won't have a sideboard, there's no way you can actually, fix your mistakes or fix your strategy. Let's say you could actually in theory deal with enchantment, but you have no way to put enchantment removal in your main board. Well, if you don't have a sideboard to go to, then maybe you're gonna lose every game against a powerful enchantment, and it's not really your fault, it's the format's fault. So while best of 1 can be a good thing, it can at the same time be a bad thing for the same reason. I mean, this is going to be something that is going to be kind of similar when it comes to pros and cons for both best of 1 and best of 3. The second con of best of 1 is all about the mana. Obviously, if you get mana flooded or mana screwed in best of 1, well, you lost. If you are playing a big tournament, well, too bad, there's nothing you can do about it. And in most tournaments, every win and every loss matters a lot in order to get into a top 8 scenario. The next con when it comes to best of 1 is about adaptation. Now I'm not talking about how you sideboard, I'm talking about how you are playing. Different players play very differently, and maybe you could beat this guy even with a deck that has a worse percentage, but because you don't have any time for adaptation, you end up losing the first game and you don't get a chance to show that you were actually a more skilled player. Like if you do watch the pro scene, some of the better players can win from situations that don't always seem as obvious, and this is because they are a skilled player, not only because they are, not only because they're playing a powerful deck. It's a lot about understanding how you should play the deck and playing it proper. That is why you can give people very good decks and they can still screw it up because they don't understand how they should play, and the other guy understands how they should play, or they understand what you're doing wrong and they adapt to that scenario. And that is something you are gonna lack in a best of one. The next con is all about matchups. Certain decks are a lot better post sideboard against another deck. You could have like a horrible 20% win rate in your first game, but post board, maybe it's a 50-50 or even higher. One very easy example is Esper Control against Nexus of Fate. Because Esper Control has so many spot removals, and because Nexus of Fate has really no creatures, well, pre-board, the Esper Control deck is gonna have a tough time, but once they are allowed to remove all their useless targeted removals, they're gonna have a lot better second and third game against a Nexus of Fate deck. And sadly, this is something you're not gonna have in a best of one format. Now, obviously, Nexus of Fate is banned in MTG Arena, but it's not banned in best of threes in MTG Arena, and it's not banned in the standard game. Of course, following this train of thoughts, I do have to mention another con, and that is decks that are actually viable because they have a sideboard, obviously not going to be viable in a best of one format, and it kind of ties in with the whole point I was trying to make. Let's move on to the final con of best of one, and that is the fact that MTG is balanced around having a sideboard, and that's something you're not going to be able to go around. They could always announce like tomorrow that they're gonna scrap the sideboard and go best of one only, but yeah, I doubt that it's actually gonna happen. Anyway, let's move on to the pros and cons of best of threes. And the first pro is gonna be there is much deeper strategy in a best of three game, either as a player or as a viewer. Obviously, when it comes to best of threes, there are so many things you can talk about. There's so many things you need to think about, like how do I sideboard? Was this actually the right sideboard? Like you can write whole articles about if the player made the right decision to sideboard this versus that, and was the sideboard the reason why he lost? Did he do something very strange that didn't really work but could have worked? There's just so much strategy when it comes to the sideboard and when it comes to best of threes. Obviously, this is both a pro and a con of best of threes. If you are into like deep strategy and a lot of thinking, obviously best of three is gonna be your chosen format. Maybe if you are a casual viewer, you won't mind this, but you're not really gonna understand it when the commentators start talking about it and they don't go very in depth. Let's move on to the next pro, which was a con when it came to best of ones, and that is you're much more unlikely to lose an entire tournament or an entire ranked game because of you getting mana screwed or mana flooded. It still can happen, it still sucks, but you are actually able to, come back from it because you have more games to play. Obviously, if it is your final game in the final, or your final game to get into Mythic, you might still get really pissed. But overall, best of threes allows you to correct such mistakes because you do have a game number 2 and 3 to look forward to. Another pro when it comes to best of threes, that also was a con in best of one, is the fact that you are allowed to correct your deck with the sideboard. Not all matchups that are bad for you are not your fault. You can't fit in every single counter to everything in your main board. I mean, you could try, but your deck would be very inconsistent. And obviously with a sideboard, you are now allowed to correct it, so you have no one really to blame, unless you'd never draw it, of course. I mean, if you only include a single copy of enchantment removal as your one counter against enchantments, and that's the only way you lose, then it's your fault. If you don't have any enchantment removal at all in your colors, then that's not your fault. Anyway, let's move on to the final pro when it comes to best of threes, and that is the fact that the game was built around sideboard. It's balanced around having a sideboard, so obviously this is going to be a huge pro when it comes to best of threes. But that will do it for the pros of best of threes, at least the big ones that I can think about right now, and let's move on to the cons of best of threes. So what are the cons when it comes to best of threes? Well, let's look at the first con. It requires more cards. Now obviously, as a new player, this can be a huge issue and can be one of the reasons why you are never gonna try best of three, because you don't have either the money in case you're playing the physical game, or you don't have the money for the wildcards if you're playing MTG Arena. There's nothing wrong with it, but obviously this is a con for people getting into the format. The same thing can be said about Legacy. I mean, not everyone wants to spend $1,000 just to get a deck that can function in Legacy. Yes, I know you can play mono red, or mono burn, but let's be honest, not everyone wants to play Legacy burn. The next con was something that was also a pro when it came to best of three, and that is the fact that it does require so much knowledge in order to play it efficiently. I know that you can still have fun playing best of three, but if you are a very competitive player, then there are a lot of things you have to learn. Although most really competitive players don't mind it, but some people that think of themselves as competitive players might find an issue with just how much information they need to absorb in order to reach the top or their peak performance in the game. The third con when it comes to best of three is the fact that very often the variation between decks in high level of play is very low. Usually the meta will establish itself, and at some point there will just be a couple of decks you can pick between if you actually want to play constructed in standard, which is a pity, but you know, that's something that happens with every card game at some point. The meta gets figured out and there's not much you can do about it until the rotation happens. Another con when it comes to best of three is the fact that it takes so long, and to a newer player this can be really off-putting. You don't want to spend 40 minutes in order to play a single best of three, or maybe you don't want to watch a whole tournament. Like if you did watch the first Mythic Championship, or if you're watching the SCG or the Pro Tour, you know that those broadcasts can last like an entire day. It's a very long process, and as a new player, this can seem very off-putting when you have to spend so much time with it. Obviously, if you love Magic, this is not an issue for you, but for a new player trying to get into the game, this can seem to be a very big deal when everything takes so long. And that will conclude my pros and cons when it comes to best of one versus best of three in MTG. Personally, I do prefer best of three over best of one when it comes to watching and playing, assuming I want to take the time to play a proper best of three. But that will conclude this video. Now, if you do feel like I missed some pros or cons, do leave them in the comments down below, so I can see what other people are considering pros and cons when it comes to MTG formats. And also leave whatever your preferred format is when it comes to watching and playing. But that will do it for this one. I will catch you in the next one. This is Project signing out.